Welcome to our second lesson in Unit 1, Foundational Ideas of Government for our U.S. Constitution and American Citizenship class. You should be following along using the note sheet posted to the Google Classroom titled Topic 1.2, America's Answer Notes. You should be filling the blanks on your note sheet as we go along, but I'll be giving you additional information if you're listening to this video, which I truly hope that you are. In the first lesson, we addressed things like what types of government exist and where government power comes from and what rights exist, if you have rights, things like that. Now, we gave you a bunch of different theoretical answers to those questions. Today, the goal is to try to get you guys to understand how America answers these questions. How does our system of government answer questions about where government power comes from and what individual rights you have? So that's the goal of today's lesson. Our first key question here is, what are our rights as Americans and where do they come from in the first place? To answer this, we're going to be analyzing some quotations from foundational documents that were written by the people who wrote our government system. We're going to analyze them, figure out some vocabulary, and try to figure out what they were thinking, or at least what they thought the answers were to these key questions when they wrote the Constitution. Our first quote comes from the Declaration of Independence. You probably remember this from your U.S. history class. This was the document that the Founding Fathers wrote and signed, declaring that we were at war with England and that we were no longer going to be part of their government system. This document does a great job of helping us understand what the people who created our government, what they thought about what government power was, where it came from, and what the limits to that power are. So let's get started with our first quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Before we can really translate and figure out what this quote says and what it tells us about what our rights are and where they come from, we first have to define some key terms from this quote to help you build your vocabulary. Some key words here are self-evident. It's just a fancy way of saying that it's easy for anyone to see. Endowed means given. Their creator, this is referring to whatever god or gods you believe in, or nature itself. Now, some people say the Founding Fathers were all Christian. This is not true. Not all the founders worship the Christian God. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, the person who wrote this line, was not a Christian himself. Instead, he followed a religion called deism. The next term is unalienable. This means something that can't be taken away from you. It's so core to you as a person that no one, nothing is able to rip it away. And then the final one being liberty, a word that gets thrown around a lot. This means freedom from being unreasonably forced to do things. Not free from being forced to do things, but free from being unreasonably forced to do things. The difference between being reasonably forced to do something and unreasonably forced to do something, there really isn't a clear-cut distinction. We're still arguing about what this means to this very day in our country. All right, now that you've got the definitions down, let's take another look at this quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, this is from the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. So these words give us an insight to what type of government Americans were trying to create during the founding days of our nation. So take a few minutes, think about this quote, think about the definitions, and on your worksheet, your note sheet, translate this quote into your own words. So go ahead and pause the video, and again, try to translate this sentence yourself using the definitions we just learned. All right, now that you've taken a couple minutes to translate it for yourself, hopefully, here's the translation I generally come up with. Americans tend to believe there's certain things that are just obvious for everyone, such as everyone's equal to each other. That's just common sense. And that we're given certain rights by God that no one can take from us, not even the government. And that part's really important. The fact the government can't take it from us is going to be core to who we are as a country and the government we create. Now, among these rights are what we call natural rights. The right to our life, the right to not be unreasonably forced to do things, and the right to do things that make us happy. So you see what I did here? I just simply took the quote from earlier, and I just plugged in the definitions for the new words to make it a little bit more modern. So, what are our rights as Americans? It's the right to our life, or liberty in pursuit of happiness. Or again, in other words, the right to have our life, the right to not be unreasonably forced to do things, and the right to do things that make us happy. Those rights, we believe, come from our Creator, whatever God you believe in, or if you're not religious, it tends to come from the fact that we're human, and just by the nature of being human, we're equal. Our next key question here is why does the government exist according to America? So why do we even have one in the first place? We know what our rights are. We know where our rights come from according to the American founding fathers, but then why do we have a government? For that, again, we have to look to the Declaration of Independence. It gives us a real good clue into the minds of the founders. So this quote here is much shorter. Quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. A couple important words that you need to know about. Secure means protect, and in this case, instituted means created. So keep those two things in mind. So again, we're trying to answer the question, why does the government exist according to the people who created our government? So let's translate this quote using our new vocabulary, keeping this question in mind. So take a minute, pause the video, and translate this quote into your own words using those definitions. Now that you've taken a shot at it, here's the common translation I'd come to. Why does the government exist according to America? Governments were created to protect our right to our life, the right to not be unreasonably forced to do things, and the right to do things that make us happy. Right? Again, all I'm doing is I'm taking that previous quote, I'm taking the new words, and I'm taking their definitions and I'm plugging them in to give us a more modern understanding of the quote and give us a better understanding of why we created our government in the first place. It all really boils down to our government exists to protect our natural rights, and those natural rights are the right to our life, not be forced to do things unreasonably, and to do things that make us happy. Next, let's tackle the question, where do Americans think the government's power comes from in the first place? As we saw in the previous lesson, this question can be answered in multiple ways. Does it come from God? Does it come from the fact the government uses violence against us? Or does it come from the fact that we, the people, allow it to have power? To answer this, we're once again turning to the Declaration of Independence, a pivotal document for understanding the origins of our country and our government. This quote starts with, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It's a short phrase, but there are several words here I feel that we're going to need a little bit of help with. So deriving means getting. Just, in this case, means fair. Consent means you got permission. This is an important word. We should all know what consent means. And governed, the governed is referring here to the people who have to follow the laws that the government is creating. So when we say the governed, we're referring to the people who live under the government and follow those rules. All right, take those definitions, plug them into this new sentence, and try to figure out if you can answer the question, where does the government's power come from according to America? All right, now that you've had your chance to translate this quote to answer the question, let's take another shot at it. Where does the government's power come from according to America? According to America, government power comes from the people who are being ruled over. We, the people, give government the power to make the laws, and as long as those laws are fair, then we obey them. If they're not fair, then we don't have to, and we can take that power back. Next key question we're trying to answer here is, when should people be allowed to change their government? Should we just be forced to keep the original government? Are we allowed to make changes? If so, when? How? Under what circumstances? This is kind of crucial because there have been a lot of wars fought over the long existence of our species over this very question. Yet again, we're going back to the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson to answer the question. So, when should people be allowed to change the government? According to the Declaration, quote, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the protection of our rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. Here, there's only three terms here I think you might need help with. Alter means to change, abolish, in this case, means destroy, and institute, again, here means create. So, with those three terms in mind, Try to answer the question, when should people be allowed to change the government, by using this quote and the new definitions that you've just learned. All right, let's compare your translation and answer to the question, when should people be allowed to change the government, to the translation that I'm providing. So, when should people be allowed to change the government? If a government begins to take away our right to our life, our right to our not be unreasonably forced to do things, and the right to do things that make us happy, then people who live under the government's rules have the right to change it or destroy the government altogether and create a whole new government. Again, this is all about protecting our natural rights. So, a shorter way, even to say this, is if a government begins to hurt our natural rights, we have the right to change the government to protect our rights or to get rid of it altogether and create an entirely new one. The goal here being to protect our natural rights. Thomas Jefferson has a little bit more to teach us about when people should be allowed to change the government in the Declaration. So here's another quote for us to translate. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Here, there's some words that you're probably unfamiliar with. So here are three terms I think you might need a little bit of extra help. Prudence means to be careful. To be prudent means being careful. Dictate, in this context, means to require. So if you're dictating something, you're requiring something. And light and transient is just a fancy way of saying that small things that aren't really that serious. So take this quote and try to answer the question, when should people be allowed to change the government, using the definitions that we just provided and this quote? Again, let's compare your translation to mine. When should people be allowed to change the government? Well, being careful means that we should not change our government because of small things that don't really matter, that really aren't that serious. So you only really change the government if the violations of your natural rights are really, really serious challenges or violations of those rights. If they're small, they're around the edges, maybe there's some tweaks you can make to the government, but you really shouldn't overthrow your government for trivial things, only things that really matter. Now, Thomas Jefferson was very much aware, along with the other founding fathers, the people who created our government, that starting a civil war, which is what the American Revolution was, and overthrowing a government was a pretty serious thing, and they didn't want to set the precedent. They didn't want to set the example that you could do it whenever you wanted or for small things. That's a recipe for chaos. So he has a little bit more to say. So let's to answer this question, when should people be allowed to change the government? Thomas Jefferson has one more really important quote for us here from the Declaration. Quote, mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. A few terms here you might need some help with. Disposed, in this context, means willing to do something. So if you're disposed to do something, you're willing to do it. Sufferable means something that you can tolerate. I know that it's a little confusing because suffering means something that's horrible. You're suffering, you're having a bad time. Watching this video, you're probably suffering. But to be sufferable means it's bad, but you can tolerate it. So if you're actually making it all the way through this video, you're doing your lessons, you might not like it, but it's sufferable. You can tolerate it. And accustomed, what you're used to. If you're accustomed to something, it's something that you usually do, that you're used to, something that, it's your part of your day-to-day life. So keep those definitions in mind and try again to further answer the question, when should people be allowed to change the government based on what the founding fathers said in the Declaration? Again, let's compare your translation to mine and see how well you did. So, according to Thomas Jefferson, most people are willing to tolerate a lot of bad stuff as long as it's something that they can tolerate, right? As long as it's not too bad, they are willing to suffer because changing things is a lot of work. So, basically, what he's saying here is if a government is abusing our rights, as long as that abuse is something we can handle, then we're going to handle it, we're going to allow it to keep going. But once that violation of our rights gets to the point that it's no longer sufferable, that it's so bad we can no longer ignore it, that's when we can and will change our government. All right, so let's move on to the next key question. Can we trust the government to do the right thing when it comes to our rights? So, how much should we be trusting our government? For this, we have to get away from the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson and instead turn to a different founding father, one of the other people who helped create our government. This was James Madison. He was later a president. The capital of Wisconsin is named after this Madison. And in one of the papers he wrote trying to convince Americans to vote for this new Constitution, to create this new government, he wrote this essay called Federalist Number 47. And in it he says, quote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." Now, to answer this question, can we trust the government to do the right thing when it comes to our rights? That's a pretty long quote, a lot of fancy words there, so let's break down some of these for you. Accumulation means gathering together. If you accumulate something, you're bringing a lot of those things into your home. Legislative, this is the word we're going to be using a lot in this class, so it's important you get a handle on this and the next two. Legislative means the power to write laws. This is one of the three key powers any government has. So all governments can have legislative power, the power to create laws. They all have executive power, the power to make sure the laws are being followed, to carry out those laws, and the judicial power to make judgments about what a law means and if it was broken. So legislative, executive, and judicial power are three terms we're going to be using over and over in this class. You best memorize it now and get used to them for future lessons. But there are more words we need to break down in this quote. After all, it was pretty long and pretty wordy. Hereditary. Hereditary means you're born with it. So this can be a genetic thing, right? A genetic condition you're born with. Or in this case, he's referring to hereditary power. Power you're born with because your parents had that power. In this case, he's referring to kings giving their powers onto their sons when the king dies. Self-appointed means you give that power to yourself. No one gave you the power, you took it. Elective. Elective is another term we're going to use a lot in this class. Elective means people voted on it. Pronounced means called. So to pronounce something, you say, I'm giving it this name. And tyranny. This is a big concern of the founders. Tyranny is a government that violates your natural rights. Any government that takes an action that violates your right to your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, that is tyrannical. That is tyranny. All right, that's a lot of vocabulary, a lot of definitions here, and a big quote. So let's try again, take a minute here and try to answer the question, can we trust the government to do the right thing when it comes to our rights? Okay? Take a moment, translate it for yourself using those definitions. Okay, comparison time. So now that you've translated, let's compare it to my translation. And remember, we're trying to answer the question, can we trust the government to do the right thing when it comes to our rights? So let's see what Madison has to say about this. Right? He's basically saying if someone or even a group of people share the three main powers of government, the power to make and enforce and make judgments about the law, they're going to abuse that power no matter how they got it. It doesn't matter if they got that power because they were born into the position of power, or if they took it for themselves, or even if people voted them to have the power. Anyone or group who collects all three of these powers like infinity stones, they're going to abuse them, and they're going to abuse them by hurting our natural rights. Now, Madison continues on this theme of trying to answer this question, can we trust our government to protect our rights? He continues this in another essay known as Federalist Number 51. There were a lot of these essays. Listen to the Hamilton musical. They talk about it. Also, pretty good musical. All right, so he says, quote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Again, a lot of fancy words here from about 200 plus years ago, so let's take a minute and translate some of these key phrases and words from this quote. He says, so external nor internal controls. So what here he's talking about is ways for people to control the government and for the government to control itself. So people need to have a way that they can keep the government from hurting us, but they also need to have a way so the government does this job so we don't have to be as worried about it. When he says framing a government, what he's talking about here is creating the rules for how the government will use its power. So, governments can do anything, but the government that we want to create, we're going to frame it. We're going to create rules for how it can use its power and rules for how it cannot use its power. Governed, again, this is the word we've seen before, these are the people who have to follow the laws that the government is creating. And oblige means make someone to do something. With those definitions in mind, try to translate what is Madison saying here about the question, can we trust the government to do the right thing when it comes to our rights? Again, comparison time. So, what is Madison saying here about this question of can we trust the government when it comes to our rights? He's saying people are not perfect. So, you have to find a way for the government to be able to stop them from hurting each other's natural rights. Right? People are naturally going to try to hurt each other, so you need a government to stop that. But because governments are made up of imperfect people, you have to find a way to stop that government from also hurting people's rights. So, in the first place, you have to create a government that's strong enough to stop us from hurting each other, but then make sure that government doesn't hurt us as well. All right, let's move on to another key question here. Why do the answers to these previous questions matter, right? Or, in other words, why you should actually care about anything we've just spent all this time talking about. First and foremost, if our rights come from nature or gods, then the government can't violate them, and that's important. That creates an automatic limit on what governments can do. So, government power is not unlimited. Governments cannot do whatever they want to us, and so that gives us some protection. Second, if governments exist to protect our rights, then everything they do should be about keeping those rights safe. This means government shouldn't take our life or unreasonably force us to do things. Yes, it can force us to do things like not go 90 on Lake Drive, but it shouldn't unreasonably force us to do things. And the government shouldn't be getting in the way of us doing things that make us happy unless they have a really, really good reason for stopping us, right? And that's for the protection of other people's natural rights. Third, if government power comes from the people it rules over, that means we're in charge of the government, not the other way around. This means we get to tell the government what it can do and what it can't do, how it can use its power and how it cannot use its power. It also means we have the right to change the government if we feel it's not doing the job of protecting our natural rights. So again, the logical extension of this is, our current president, his job, he's not our boss. We are his boss. The president is our servant. We are not the president's subjects. And four, just because we can change the government, that doesn't mean we always should, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. To take this further, this means anytime we change the government, we should have a really good reason for doing it. And the main reason for changing the government is to do a better job at protecting our natural rights. By now, hopefully, you've memorized the fact that those natural rights are the right to our life, the right to not unreasonably be forced to do things, and the right to do things that make ourselves happy. And finally, 5. If the government is not perfect, and the government's made up of people, then it's dangerous to give that government too much power. This is at the core of everything we do in our government. We, the people, are afraid the government will use its power to hurt our natural rights. And we, the people, are in charge of the government, but we're also imperfect, which means we have to be careful who we share that power with. And as part of this, this means you have to find a way to limit the damage governments can do to our natural rights, because any power can be used to help and be used to hurt. A gun can be used to save a life. It can also be used to take a life. And that's what government power is. It's this powerful tool that can be used to protect us, but those same tools can then be used to hurt us. And so we have to be really careful about this. All right, as always, at the end of your worksheet, at the end of your notes here, I want you to take a moment and rewrite today's goal. Either write it out word for word from the top of the sheet, so all the way you scroll at the top, there's the goal, that's what we're trying to do. Either rewrite that word for word the same, or if you want, try to put it in your own words. Then take 3 facts from our notes today that show that you have an understanding of that goal. Finally, as always, I want you to end with one question you still have that can help you better understand this topic, or really any question related to government politics, related to the lesson. What I'm really looking for here is show me that you're paying attention. Show me you're thinking, because if you were paying attention, if you were thinking, you've got a question, so write it down, and I'll answer that for you in the Google Doc. All right, we'll see you in class, and have a good day.